They always thought you'd stay, that no matter how many times they overlooked you, talked over you, twisted your words, you'd still be there, silent, reliable, soft. You gave warning signs, but they called it drama. You forgave more than they even realized, but they called it weakness. You bent until you were barely recognizable to yourself. And when you finally broke, they acted surprised. But the truth? You didn't just snap. They pushed, and pushed, and kept pushing until something inside you didn't just crack. It changed. You didn't raise your voice. You didn't throw plates or write angry letters. You simply stopped. You stopped explaining, stopped waiting, stopped hoping they'd finally see what they were destroying. They'll call it revenge, but it isn't. This isn't some petty, bitter payback. No. This is what happens when patience bleeds out. When kindness finally realizes it's been weaponized. When someone who gave chances like oxygen finally runs out of breath. You didn't walk away to teach them a lesson. You walked away because you were done being the one who always stayed behind to clean up the emotional wreckage they caused. And that silence they used to love, that quiet version of you they took for granted. It became the loudest sound they've ever heard once you were gone. Now they sit in their own echo chamber, haunted by the absence of the one person who held everything together without making a scene. They thought you going quiet meant surrender, but really, it meant strategy. It meant self-respect. It meant you'd reached the edge of yourself and finally turned around. Because silence isn't weakness. It's a decision, a choice to stop pouring into people who only ever held you with one hand and stabbed you with the other. You didn't disappear. You evolved. You grew into the space they said you were too soft to fill. And now, they'll feel it, not in a loud exit, but in the quiet void you left behind. You warned them. You forgave them. You gave them more than most would. But they pushed you too far. And now they'll regret it. Not because you tried to hurt them, but because you finally stopped hurting yourself for their comfort. This is what happens when the soft one stops bending. It didn't happen in one moment. That's what they'll never understand. You didn't just wake up one day and decide to leave. No, it was 1,000 small cuts. Words that stung but were passed off as jokes. Glances that said more than silence ever could. The way your messages were left unread. The way your emotions were treated like they never saw. The way you stared at your phone, waiting for a response that never came. They didn't notice the way your voice trembled when you were explaining yourself for the 5th time, just hoping they'd finally understand. They didn't catch how you laughed less and hesitated more. You started second-guessing your worth, thinking maybe it was your fault. Maybe you were too much, too emotional, too needy. But deep down, a quiet voice kept asking, why is it always you doing the mending? Why are you the only one making the effort? And that question, it lingered. It grew louder. It wasn't the screaming that made you leave. It was the silence that followed after you begged to be seen. You were met with sighs, eye rolls, and the same tired phrase. Here we go again. But you weren't going again. You were ending. You were unraveling, quietly, in the corners of conversations where your presence was treated like background noise. And still you stayed. Because you believed in people. You saw their potential, even when they failed you repeatedly. But belief without boundaries becomes self-betrayal. And that's what this became, betrayal not by them, but by the version of you that kept allowing it. Then came that moment, that final straw that didn't even look like a storm. Maybe it was a missed apology, a mocking comment, a forgotten promise, something so small they'd call you dramatic for reacting to it. But for you, it was the collapse of a dam. All the water behind it, your patience, your pain, your dignity, spilled out at once. And for the first time, you didn't yell, you didn't cry, you didn't try to fix it. You just looked around at the ruins and realized you were done pretending it could be repaired. They didn't notice the exact second you checked out, but they'll remember what came next forever. The version of you they had grown so used to, the one who always explained, always forgave, always showed up, was gone. You weren't angry, you were empty. You didn't want revenge, you wanted peace, and you finally understood that you couldn't have both, not with them. So you left. Maybe not physically right away, but mentally, emotionally, you were out the door before they even knew there was one. You stopped responding with paragraphs and started answering with silence. You stopped trying to decode mixed signals and started listening to your own. You saw how you were always the one, apologizing, even when you were the one bleeding. And something inside you whispered, no more. No more bending, no more justifying your pain, no more softening yourself to fit inside a space that never made room for you. And what did they do? They shrugged, rolled their eyes, said you were being too sensitive. That was the final push, not just their action, but their apathy. Because what destroys you more than cruelty is being unseen. They didn't push you with force. They pushed you with disregard. And when you finally walked away, they called you cold. But they didn't feel the temperature drop when they left you alone in the dark for months, emotionally freezing. They didn't see how you lit candles for everyone else's darkness while your own flame flickered, desperate for warmth. They never realized you were drowning while keeping everyone else afloat. So yes, when you finally stood up, it felt sudden to them, but to you it was survival. It wasn't rage. It wasn't revenge. It was release. The quiet kind. The kind where you pick up your broken pieces, put on your coat, and step into the cold world without saying a word. Not because you had nothing to say, but because they didn't deserve to hear it anymore. And now they sit in their comfort, unaware that the game they were playing had an expiration date. They pushed you too far, and you didn't break. You evolved. You stopped responding. You stopped caring. You stopped making excuses for behavior that was never yours to fix. And with that shift, the story changed. You were no longer the one being abandoned. You became the one who walked away. That was the breaking point. Not just when they hurt you, but when you finally stopped hurting yourself trying to stay. You became the line that wouldn't be crossed anymore, the boundary they never expected to meet. And that quiet, irreversible walk away, that's what they'll regret. Not your anger, not your words, but your absence. You could have screamed. You could have shattered the silence with every unspoken truth, every buried frustration, every wound they left open, and walked past like it wasn't bleeding. But you didn't. You swallowed it all. Out of love, out of fear, out of the desperate hope that one day, maybe, they'd finally understand. You didn't say how their jokes cut deeper than insults, how their silence during your storms was louder than any screaming match could have been. You didn't say how each ignored message, each passive shrug, each eye roll when you were vulnerable felt like a knife dressed in indifference. And somehow, you kept showing up, kept giving, kept hoping, but inside you were folding in on yourself, quietly, painfully. You smiled through dinners where your voice felt like background noise. You laughed at jokes that left bruises on your spirit. You nodded through conversations where your thoughts were silenced, not because they asked you to stay quiet, but because they never noticed you weren't speaking anymore. And you told yourself, it's okay, maybe they're tired, maybe I'm just being sensitive. But you wanted to tell them that every time they looked past your pain, it felt like being erased. That loyalty isn't just about staying, it's about listening, showing up, choosing each other, even when it's hard. But instead of confronting them, you bit your tongue. Why? Because you were afraid. Afraid they'd call you dramatic. Afraid they'd say, you're overthinking again. You were terrified that speaking your truth would mean losing them. So you sacrificed your voice just to keep a connection alive. But what kind of connection survives if it demands your silence? Did they think you didn't feel that? The shifts in tone, the change in energy, the sudden pauses in conversations that used to flow so effortlessly. Did they think loyalty meant you'd endure anything just to avoid conflict? That you'd keep explaining, keep giving, keep lowering your standards until you had nothing left to protect? You wanted to scream, "Do you not see me breaking?" But you didn't. Because deep down, a part of you was still waiting for validation, for understanding, for love to come in the form you deserved. And that part? It started dying a little more each day. You stayed silent when they disrespected you in front of others. You swallowed your pain when they gave their time to everyone else but left you hanging with empty promises. You stayed patient when they ghosted your needs, yet expected you to understand their mood swings. You even justified their distance, telling yourself they're just going through something. But who was there when you were going through something? Who sat beside you when your mind was loud, your heart exhausted, your soul aching for just a moment of genuine connection? No one. You carried yourself through storms while they watched from shelter, comfortable. And still, you chose not to speak. Not because you had nothing to say, but because your truth had already been ignored too many times. You learned to read the room so well that you stopped entering it with your full self. You dulled your shine so they wouldn't feel insecure. You softened your tone, your boundaries, your emotions, just to keep the peace. But what peace? There's no peace in pretending you're not hurt. You wanted to tell them you noticed the way they changed, that you saw the way they only reached for you when they needed something, that love isn't real if it's only present in convenience. But instead, you stayed quiet, telling yourself silence was safer than vulnerability, safer than another rejection, safer than seeing them shrug off your pain again. Because nothing hurts more than exposing your wounds to someone who laughs at the blood. But silence doesn't mean peace. It means restraint. It means you chose dignity over desperation. It means you held your truth like a flame in your hands, knowing it would burn you more to give it away to someone who didn't care. You weren't silent because you didn't feel. You were silent because you felt too much. And eventually, you realized the things you wanted to say, they weren't for them. They were for you. You started talking to yourself differently, stopped apologizing for caring too much, stopped shrinking your worth to fit their small perception of it. And slowly, your silence transformed. From suppression into strength. From repression into strategy. You started realizing that your value doesn't need a witness to be real, that your story doesn't require their approval to be valid, that you are allowed to walk away even if they never gave you a reason to. Because not every goodbye comes with closure. Sometimes it comes with unanswered questions, with all the things you never said echoing in the spaces where love used to live. And that's okay. Some things are better left unsaid, not because they don't matter, but because the people they were meant for didn't listen when they had the chance. So yes, you could have said it all, every truth, every ache, every ounce of frustration that weighed you down for months, maybe years. You could have looked them in the eye and laid bare every bruise they left on your heart. But instead, you chose silence, not as surrender, but as a final statement. A declaration that your peace means more than their comfort, that your healing isn't up for discussion, that your worth doesn't need their validation. And that decision? It wasn't weakness, it was war. Because sometimes the most powerful thing you'll ever say is nothing at all. It didn't come like lightning. It didn't roar in like a storm. The realization crept in slowly, quietly, like dawn slipping past the horizon after a long, suffocating night. You were sitting there again in the silence they left behind. No explanations, no concern. Just another moment where your pain was too invisible to be acknowledged. And that's when it hit you. Not all at once, but heavy enough to knock the wind from your soul. It was never about you being too sensitive. You weren't broken. You weren't dramatic. You were just surrounded by people far too numb to feel what you felt. Too distracted to notice the depth of someone like you. Too selfish to handle a heart that actually cared. You always thought that if you could just communicate better, be more calm, more logical, more composed, maybe they'd understand. You twisted yourself into versions so unnatural, you barely recognized your own reflection. All to keep people close who never once tried to meet you halfway. You thought your love had to prove something, that your loyalty had to be earned over and over again, even when it had already been offered in full. And every time they failed to see you, you blamed yourself. You convinced yourself you were too much. But the truth? You were never too much. They were never enough. The clarity didn't bring joy. It brought grief first. Grief for the years you spent trying to decode what you did wrong, when all you ever did was love right. Grief for the friendships where you begged for support and only got silence. For the relationships where you screamed internally while smiling externally, trying to keep it together for people who were never even paying attention. You gave your best and convinced yourself it wasn't good enough, when in reality, it was far too good for the places you were offering it. And then, something shifted. You stopped asking what you could have done differently. You stopped playing scenes in your head, trying to rewrite the moments where you messed up. Because you finally saw it. You didn't mess up. You showed up. You gave. You stayed. And still, they made you feel like a burden for needing what they weren't capable of giving. That wasn't your failure. That was their limit. You looked in the mirror and saw not someone flawed, but someone strong. Not perfect, but pure. A person who had the courage to love loudly in a world that praises indifference. A soul that held space for everyone, but was rarely held in return. And that's when the blame started falling off your shoulders like weights you didn't realize you were carrying. The guilt, the shame, the self-doubt. It didn't belong to you. It was never yours to hold. You finally understood that you weren't meant to be the fixer, the healer, the always available backup plan. You were meant to be whole. And wholeness doesn't beg to be tolerated. It stands firm in its worth. You began to see the patterns for what they were. The cycles, the mind games, the way they only loved you when it was convenient, the way they disappeared the moment your needs became real. And this time, instead of internalizing it, You recognized it. You saw through the illusion. They weren't uncomfortable because you were too intense. They were exposed because your presence demanded authenticity. And they weren't ready for that, so they left. This realization didn't just free you, it rebuilt you. You started setting boundaries, not as a punishment to others, but as protection for yourself. You began speaking softer to yourself, praising your growth, honoring the way you still loved, with an open heart after all the damage. You started measuring relationships by how safe you felt in your silence, not how loud their promises were. You found peace in your own company, not loneliness, peace. Because finally the inner war stopped. The one where you fought to be understood by people committed to misunderstanding you. That battle ended, and in its place, clarity bloomed. You don't chase anymore, not because you don't care, but because you finally do. You care enough about yourself now to stop running after doors that were never yours to knock on in the first place. You see now that your depth, your empathy, your love, it's a gift. A rare one, not something to hand out to those who can't even carry it without dropping it. You deserve people who choose you the first time, who see you clearly and still stay, who don't flinch when you speak your truth. And so you keep walking, not away from people, but toward yourself, toward peace, toward healing, toward the version of you that's been buried under guilt and survival for far too long. You've met yourself now, and no one can convince you to forget who you are again. Because the moment you stopped blaming yourself, you stopped shrinking. And that was the beginning of everything. You didn't slam the door. You didn't throw a scene, toss their lies in their face, or leave a trail of chaos behind. You didn't make noise, because silence had become your greatest act of self-respect. The most haunting kind of departure is the one that doesn't announce itself. It simply happens. And that's what you did. You walked away so quietly, so completely, that by the time they realized you were gone, you were already unreachable. They think closure comes with loud exits. They expect yelling, blocked numbers, maybe a bitter post or two. Something they can argue with, something that lets them feel like they still have some control. But what do they do when there's nothing? No final text, no parting words, just absence. That's when it hits them. Not the drama of loss, but the emptiness of it. Because you didn't just walk out of their life. You walked out of their emotional grip. And that kind of freedom, that kind of escape, it's irreversible. To them, your silence was sudden. To you, it was years in the making. It was every moment you held your breath instead of defending yourself. Every time you downplayed your pain to protect their comfort. Every time you said, "I'm fine," while your soul whispered, "I'm not." It was a slow undoing of everything you sacrificed just to stay visible to people who were always looking away. Your silence wasn't abrupt. It was built brick by brick, boundary by boundary, until you finally realized that the only way to be heard was to stop speaking altogether. They didn't notice when your messages got shorter, when your responses took longer, when your energy stopped filling the room the way it used to. They didn't pay attention when you stopped asking how they were, stopped showing up uninvited, stopped carrying conversations they let die long ago. To them, it was nothing. To you, it was everything. It was the quiet reclaiming of your power. You didn't leave because you hated them. You left because you finally loved yourself enough to stop bleeding for someone who never noticed the wounds. You walked away emotionally before your feet ever moved. The physical leaving was just the final chapter of a story you had already finished reading. And what they'll never understand is how deeply it hurt you to care that much, for so long, for someone who made you feel invisible. They felt the silence as rejection, but for you, silence was survival. For you, it was the only language left, when your words were constantly drowned out. You had shouted with kindness, screamed with patience, cried with consistency, and still they didn't hear you. So you stopped talking. Not because you ran out of things to say, but because you realized they had run out of chances to listen. Silence became your closure, your exit, your final statement that didn't need punctuation. And now they sit in rooms where your laughter used to echo, and the walls feel colder. They scroll through old messages hoping for a sign, a reply, a reminder that maybe you still care. But they won't find it. Because when you left, you didn't leave a door cracked open. You didn't leave breadcrumbs to follow. You left, completely. And that kind of departure, that's the kind that lingers forever. They didn't expect you to stop caring, because you always did. You were the one who stayed through storms, the one who forgave too easily, who gave too much, even when your hands were empty. They thought your heart was a revolving door, one they could walk through whenever guilt kicked in or loneliness crept up. But the last time they came back, the door wasn't there. Just space, just quiet, just the echo of every. You didn't walk away cold. You walked away wiser, stronger, clearer. You learned that peace is worth more than closure, that dignity is louder than revenge, that leaving doesn't always mean turning your back. It sometimes means facing yourself for the first time in years and whispering, "You deserve better." And that whisper, that became your battle cry. You didn't need to announce your worth, you embodied it. You started walking differently, not because you were running from them, but because you were walking toward something, toward healing, toward freedom, toward the version of you that no longer makes excuses for neglect disguised as love. You stopped looking back, not because there wasn't pain, but because you'd already carried it long enough. You weren't escaping, you were evolving, and what they'll never say out loud, but will feel in every silence, every empty space, every quiet night, is that your absence is louder than your presence ever was. They will try to replace you. They will look for your voice in shallow conversations, your loyalty in temporary people. They will try to mimic the feeling of being seen the way only you saw them. But it won't work. Because you weren't just another person. You were a sanctuary, and they burned it down thinking the warmth would last. But that warmth left with you. And now they sit in the cold, not because you cursed them, but because they failed to cherish the light while they had it. That's the cruel irony of loss. They never think it's real until it's irreversible. And now they're finally learning that silence isn't the absence of love. It's the proof that love was mishandled, misused, and finally let go. You didn't slam the door, you just stopped holding it open. And that's what they'll regret most. You weren't supposed to survive it, at least not according to them. They thought if they pushed hard enough, you'd finally break, snap under the pressure of carrying so many unspoken emotions, collapse from the weight of always being the strong one. They labeled your sensitivity as weakness, called your boundaries too much. They mocked the depth of your heart as if loving too deeply was something to be ashamed of. Every time you tried to explain how you felt, they rolled their eyes, dismissed your truth, labeled you dramatic, emotional, an overthinker, as if caring was a flaw, as if understanding your own pain was a crime. But here you are, still standing, still breathing, still rising. You weren't built to break, you were built to bend, to stretch and sway through storms that would have snapped others in half. You were the tree they tried to chop down with insults, manipulation, and neglect. But you had roots, roots that grew deeper every time they tried to shake your foundation. While they were busy underestimating you, misjudging your silence for surrender, you were evolving in secret, quietly, patiently, strategically. They didn't know what they were pushing. They thought they were dealing with a person who needed them. But what they didn't realize was that they were pushing a storm that had been gathering for years. And when storms get quiet, that's when they're most dangerous. You weren't lashing out, not because you didn't have rage, but because you were storing it in strength. You weren't reacting, not because you were okay, but because you were choosing your battles like someone who knows their worth. They thought your silence was surrender, but it was just your strategy. Survive first, rise later. You carried things people wouldn't have survived for a week. The betrayal? You buried it in your chest and kept walking. The abandonment? You turned it into motivation. The heartbreak? You stitched your own soul back together with threads of resilience. While they laughed at your pain, you were writing your comeback. While they questioned your sanity, you were building your peace. Every time they said you're too sensitive, you were being taught exactly where not to give your energy again. You learned the hard way that people confuse your heart for a weakness until they see the steel behind your smile. That being soft in a world that demands hardness is not a flaw, it's a revolution. You weren't made to fit into shallow molds, you were made to break them. And every time someone tried to reduce your worth, you grew louder in your silence, stronger in your stillness. Because surviving them wasn't just about walking away. It was about not letting them turn you into what hurt you. It was about not becoming bitter, even when you had every reason to be. Not becoming cold, even when the world gave you frostbite. You stayed warm, not for them, but for you. Because even if they mistook your kindness for weakness, you knew better. You knew your kindness was a choice, not a flaw. It took discipline to not retaliate. It took power to stay calm. And it took everything to keep being real in a world that kept trying to make you fake. They didn't realize you weren't seeking revenge. You were seeking restoration. Not for them, for yourself. You wanted your peace back, your clarity, your joy. And when they saw you rising without their validation, when they noticed you glowing without their presence, that's when it hit them. They hadn't broken you. They had revealed you. You were never meant to be understood by people who live at surface level. You were never meant to be loved halfway. You were never meant to be seen through cloudy eyes. And now you know that. You no longer shrink to be digestible. You no longer dim to make others feel bright. You no longer apologize for the volume of your soul. They called you too much, but maybe they were just never enough. You weren't built to break. You were built to bend, adapt, learn, grow, outgrow, evolve, and then rise so high they have to squint just to see the outline of who you used to be. And now they sit with that silence, with that distance, trying to figure out how you kept going. But you know the truth. You never stopped. You just started walking in a direction where their presence no longer reached. And that was the beginning of everything they thought you'd never become. They didn't notice the silence at first. It felt like a pause, a space they thought they created, a minor gap between one of their self-centered episodes, and the next moment you'd crawl back with your heart in your hands. But this time, there was no comeback, no apology, no over-explaining, just silence. Real, heavy, echoing silence. And as the hours turned into days, and the days stretched into weeks, that silence turned into a void. It didn't scream, it whispered, louder than their noise ever could. They remembered the way they used to laugh at your intensity, how you'd express how something made you feel, and they'd smirk like you were being dramatic. Now, that laughter has dried up. Now, their room is quiet. They stare at their screen, hoping for a notification that will never come. They scroll through old messages, rereading your words, the ones they once brushed off. They play back your voice notes in their head, the ones they never responded to properly, and now they find themselves craving that same energy they took for granted. They called it space. You called it self-respect. Because for the first time, you weren't begging to be seen. You weren't offering your love like a discount product. You weren't bending until you broke. You chose yourself, and they feel it deeply, bitterly, and far too late. They try calling, but it goes to voicemail. They send long, rambling texts they never would have dared send when you were still responding in real time. Now, the messages hang up. They didn't realize you weren't seeking revenge. You were seeking restoration, not for them, for yourself. You wanted your peace back, your clarity, your joy. And when they saw you rising without their validation, when they noticed you glowing without their presence, that's when it hit them. They hadn't broken you. They had revealed you. You were never meant to be understood by people who live at surface level. You were never meant to be loved halfway. You were never meant to be seen through cloudy eyes. And now you know that. You no longer shrink to be digestible. You no longer dim to make others feel bright. You no longer apologize for the volume of your soul. They called you too much, but maybe they were just never enough. You weren't built to break. You were built to bend, adapt, learn, grow, outgrow, evolve, and then rise so high they have to squint just to see the outline of who you used to be. And now they sit with that silence, with that distance, trying to figure out how you kept going. But you know the truth. You never stopped. You just started walking in a direction where their presence no longer reached. And that was the beginning of everything they thought you'd never become. They didn't notice the silence at first. It felt like a pause, a space they thought they created, a minor gap between one of their self-centered episodes, and the next moment you'd crawl back with your heart in your hands. But this time, there was no comeback, no apology, no over-explaining, just silence. Real, heavy, echoing silence. And as the hours turned into days, and the days stretched into weeks, that silence turned into a void. It didn't scream, it whispered, louder than their noise ever could. They remembered the way they used to laugh at your intensity, how you'd express how something made you feel, and they'd smirk like you were being dramatic. Now, that laughter has dried up. Now, their room is quiet. They stare at their screen, hoping for a notification that will never come. They scroll through old messages, rereading your words, the ones they once brushed off. They play back your voice notes in their head, the ones they never responded to properly, and now they find themselves craving that same energy they took for granted. They called it space. You called it self-respect. Because for the first time, you weren't begging to be seen. You weren't offering your love like a discount product. You weren't bending until you broke. You chose yourself, and they feel it deeply, bitterly, and far too late. They try calling, but it goes to voicemail. They send long, rambling texts they never would have dared send when you were still responding in real time. Now, the messages hang up. They didn't think your absence would hurt this way. They thought you were dependent, addicted, emotionally attached, in a way that made you predictable. They never imagined that your kindness had a limit. But now, the realization slaps them daily. Every meme they want to send you, every small success they wish to share, every breakdown where you used to be their soft place to land, none of it reaches you. Because you're no longer reachable. You've outgrown the cycle, broken the pattern, deleted the blueprint they used to navigate your forgiveness. And oh, how the tables have turned. Where once they found comfort in your vulnerability, now they find confusion in your distance. Where once they dismissed your needs as nagging, now they miss the way you used to check in on their emotions before your own. Where once they called your love too much, now they scroll through shallow conversations with people who don't even scratch the surface. And they feel it. Not just the lack of communication, but the loss of connection. They don't just miss your presence. They miss how your presence made them feel. Safe, seen, significant. The silence you left behind. It's not just quiet. It's loud, it's alive. It's a daily reminder of everything they took for granted. They wake up, hoping today's the day you'll reach out again. But you won't, because that version of you, the one who stayed, who fought, who waited, is gone. And in her place is someone who finally knows her value, someone who doesn't need to explain why she walked away, someone who doesn't look back, not out of anger, but out of growth. And now, every room they walk into feels colder, every laugh feels hollow, every "How are you?" from a stranger reminds them of how you used to genuinely ask and deeply listen. They try to distract themselves, but distraction only works when there isn't a soul haunting every corner of your life. And you're the ghost they can't exorcise. You're the echo that won't stop. You're the silence that screams. They look in the mirror and finally see who they were when they had you, and who they've become now that they've lost you. Regret doesn't come in a single wave. It comes in patterns. In sleepless nights, in missed calls, in flashbacks. And for them, it comes strongest in the quiet. Because now, silence has become your voice, and it speaks louder than you ever did. It says, "I'm done. I deserved more, and I'm not coming back." That's what they're left with. Not a goodbye. Not a door to knock on again, but an absence so profound it becomes a presence. And now, they know. They pushed too far, and you didn't just walk away. You vanished with grace. They sit with the weight now, heavier than they ever thought silence could feel. Because it's not just the silence of your voice, but the silence of your presence. You were their mirror. The reflection they didn't want, but desperately needed. Without you, they have no one holding them accountable, no one seeing through the mask. They wear the same clothes, eat the same food, live the same life, but everything tastes different now. Duller, emptier. Because what made it rich wasn't what they had, it was who they had it with. And you're no longer part of their world. You're the story they didn't know they were ending. And now they replay every moment they dismissed, every late-night call they ignored, every soft-spoken truth they mocked, every gentle act they didn't appreciate. It all plays like a movie they never thought they'd miss until it was gone from their screen. And no matter how much they try to find that feeling again, it doesn't return, because feelings like yours don't duplicate, they imprint. You left your mark, and now that it's gone, the void you left feels infinite. You weren't noise. You were melody. You weren't a phase. You were a foundation. And while they try to treat you like an option, now they realize you were the constant, the core, the calm in their chaos. And they messed it up, not because you were hard to love, but because they weren't ready to love someone that deeply. So now they scroll, they remember, they ache. But the one thing they can't do, no matter how hard they try, is rewind time. Because that moment has passed, and with it, so have you. You don't wake up in pain anymore. That used to be the first feeling, an ache in your chest where peace should have lived. But now you rise in silence, not the kind that suffocates, but the kind that steadies. The kind that says, you made it through. Mornings start with stillness now. No more chaos. No more checking your phone hoping for a message from someone who couldn't even spell respect. Now it's just you, your breath, and your peace. There's a candle burning quietly on your windowsill. A mug of coffee you brewed not in a rush, but in ritual. You play music, not to drown your thoughts, but to dance with them. The stillness has become your strength. You walk slower these days, not because you're lost, but because you're present. Each step is grounded. Each thought is deliberate. You've become intentional, measured, calm. You used to beg for closure, chase clarity from people who couldn't give you honesty. But now you understand. You don't need answers from the ones who caused the questions. Some truths aren't given, they're chosen. And you chose yourself. That was the turning point. Not a dramatic exit, not some viral revenge moment, just a quiet shift. A silent walk out of rooms you once screamed to be seen in. They called it cold. You call it clean. They called it selfish. You call it self-respect. You learn to hold your energy like sacred ground, because it is. You don't hand it out anymore to every pair of eyes that finds you interesting for 5 minutes. You've built boundaries so tight that even your past can't slip through. The person you are now wouldn't even open the door to the people you used to wait outside for in the rain. That's growth, real, gritty, earned in silence growth. And no, you're not angry, you're aligned. You've stopped trying to explain that to people who are addicted to chaos. You don't need them who understand the peace you found. They were never built for it. They thought silence was surrender, but it was preparation. The storm wasn't the end of you. It was your becoming. You evolved in the dark, where no one applauded, where no one posted about your progress. You healed privately, so now your glow confuses them. They watch you now. They scroll. They ask mutuals about you. They say, damn, something's different. But they don't even recognize this version of you, because this version of you wouldn't even flinch at their attention. This version walks with softness and steel, speaks with calm and command, loves deeply, but only when it's safe. You spend your time differently now. You pour into books, art, your purpose. You pour into people who show up, who don't flinch at your depth, who don't run from your truth. You stopped shrinking in rooms that couldn't handle your presence. You stopped apologizing for the light in your eyes. You started choosing solitude over performance, alignment over attention, peace over proving a point. And it shows. You're stronger, not just in body but in soul. Your laugh is deeper. Your silence is richer. Your decisions sharper. You trust your gut now. You don't override your intuition for convenience. If something feels off, it is, and you walk away without fanfare. That's power. The kind you don't have to announce, just live. It's in how you move now. They feel it. Everyone does. You don't beg. You don't chase. You attract. You decide. You protect your energy like a fortress. You've become the version of yourself you used to daydream about when you were still stuck in survival. The you who walks down the street with your shoulders back and your head held high, not because you're arrogant, but because you're finally unburdened. They see it now. The ones who used to doubt you, dismiss you, degrade you. They stare from a distance, trying to reconcile who you are now with who they thought you'd always be. But that version of you, the one who waited around for apologies, she doesn't live here anymore. They pushed you, hurt you, ignored your worth. And you used every piece of that pain as fuel. You didn't build this new life out of revenge. You built it out of resurrection. And now you rise daily with no need to explain. That's the evolution. Not louder, just clearer. Not colder, just wiser. Not broken, just rebuilt. Better, calmer, unshakable. They wonder how you did it. How you transformed without their help, without their validation. But that's the secret. They were never the power source. You were. Always. They were just noise, and you were always the melody waiting to be heard by the right ones. Now you're in rooms they can't access, building things they can't copy, loving people who pour back into you without conditions. You don't even post the wins. You just live them, quietly, gratefully, and it eats them up. See, the glow hits different when it's powered by healing, not attention. When it's fed by solitude, not applause. You radiate now because nothing owns you, not their opinions, not your past, not even your old fears. You walk through fire and learned how to carry the flames without burning yourself. And that kind of energy, it can't be faked. It can't be imitated. It can only be earned. And you've earned every inch of your peace. What they don't realize is that this new version of you, the one who no longer flinches at being alone, the one who smiles without needing to be seen, isn't built from spite. It's built from truth. You peeled back every layer, sat with your own mess, faced the silence they ran from, and turned it into strength. They never thought you'd do it. They thought you'd stay stuck, stay small, stay broken. But you didn't. You rose. You stopped explaining your soul to people who only understood surfaces. You stopped pouring from a cup they kept knocking over. Now your cup overflows, but you drink first. You don't apologize for needing peace. You don't negotiate your worth. You walk in rooms now knowing who you are, not because someone told you, but because you met yourself in the dark and chose to keep going. That is evolution. That is power. That is you. Unstoppable, untouchable, and finally free. And the most beautiful part? You're just getting started. This version of you isn't the final form. It's the foundation. There's more blooming, more becoming, more rising ahead. And this time, it's all on your terms. You've only scratched the surface of your greatness. It always starts small. The way they hesitate when your name comes up. The long pause before they pretend not to care. But the truth is written in their eyes. That flicker of discomfort, the shift in their body language, they feel it, deep, because one day they woke up and realized they lost something they'll never get back. Not just a person, not just someone who loved them, but a sanctuary, a safe place in human form. And that kind of loss doesn't come with comfort. It comes with silence, long, drawn-out, unforgiving silence. The kind that wraps around their chest when they try to sleep. The kind that whispers in the back of their mind when everything else is quiet. You're not there anymore. And they know it's their fault. They regret it. All of it. Every message left unanswered, every emotion you offered that they brushed off with sarcasm or silence. Every "I'm fine," they ignored, every time they laughed when they should have listened. They thought you'd always be around, always available, always forgiving. They mistook your patience for permanence, and now they carry the weight of that mistake every day. It lingers in places they once felt proud of, because you were their mirror, and without you, they're left with their distorted reflection, a version of themselves they can't even face without flinching. You were the calm in their chaos, the one who stayed when no one else did, and they repaid you with distance, with mockery, with indifference. They didn't just break your trust. They broke the illusion that love was enough. But you didn't let that destroy you. You used it. You built a new version of yourself out of every piece they cracked. Stronger, quieter, wiser. And that's what really haunts them. Not your absence, but your evolution. Not your silence, but your success. They see you now, maybe on a screen, maybe through someone else's story, maybe in their own mind when they're laying awake, replaying everything, and it hits. Not just nostalgia, not just longing, but shame. The deep kind. The kind that whispers, "You did this. You lost this. And now it's too late." They whisper your name sometimes, but never aloud, because guilt is a private thing, and this is their silent punishment, because they thought they broke you, but all they did was force you to rebuild, smarter, braver, and now you shine in ways they can't explain. You laugh in ways they no longer get to hear. You love again, but never like before. Because now your love, they keep trying to find bits of you in other people now, trying to mimic the connection, the understanding, the softness you brought into the room without ever needing to speak. But it never feels the same. It never lands the way you did. Because you weren't a vibe. You were the moment. The one who listened when no one else did. The one who could see the storm behind a smile. And they hated that you could see through them. Until they lost it. Now they crave the honesty they used to mock. They thought your depth made you weak. That your loyalty made you predictable. That your silence meant surrender. But now they understand. Too late. That silence was a strategy. It was strength. It was the foundation you were building in the background while they laughed. Now, that laugh is gone, replaced by a choke in the throat every time someone mentions your name. Replaced by a stomach drop every time they hear a song you used to hum. You became a ghost with presence, a memory that haunts them louder than any argument ever could. They scroll through old messages they never responded to. Reread the ones where you poured your heart out. Sometimes they even type something out, thinking maybe, just maybe, you'll reply. But they don't send it, because they know. That door isn't just closed, it's gone. There's no bridge to rebuild when the foundation is ash. And they were the match. The ones who burned it down while you stood there holding water, begging for peace. And now you are peace without them. So, they'll regret it, every choice. Every moment they chose ego over empathy, pride over presence. Every time they needed to be right instead of being kind. They'll regret it for the rest of their lives. But that's not your burden anymore. That's their lesson. You were the warning, now you're the consequence. And they'll live with that truth in silence just like you did. Only now your silence is power, and theirs, punishment. Because some losses don't scream, they whisper, in quiet moments, in reflections, in the echo of everything they took for granted. And now, you've moved on, not out of anger, but out of alignment. You're not who you were, and they'll never know who you are becoming. That regret, it'll echo long after the world stops spinning around your name, because they didn't just lose you, they lost their chance. And that kind of mistake, it lives forever. You're gone now, not just physically, but emotionally, mentally, spiritually. That cord they kept pulling on, hoping you'd come running back, it's been cut. And not with anger, not with bitterness, but with peace. The kind of peace that comes from knowing you did your part. You gave chances, explanations, patience, and they took every bit of it and treated it like you no longer check your phone hoping they reached out. That reflex, the one that used to live in your fingertips, that split-second glance every time your phone lit up, is gone. You don't wonder what they're thinking anymore. You don't replay old messages in your head, trying to decode hidden meanings or what-if scenarios. That part of you, the part that waited, it no longer exists. It didn't die with pain. It evolved with clarity. Because now you understand the silence wasn't rejection, it was protection. The distance wasn't cruelty, it was redirection. And you listened. They want access now. They want a response, even a cold one. They want to break the silence they once demanded. But you don't give them that satisfaction, not because you're trying to punish them, but because you no longer owe them explanations. You learn that closure doesn't come from conversations, it comes from decisions. And you decided to choose yourself. They can scroll through memories all they want. They can try to resurrect moments they buried while you were still alive in them. But you've burned that bridge, not out of spite, but survival. You became the consequence no one saw coming, not out of vengeance, but evolution. You didn't scream, you didn't fight, you didn't beg them to stay. You just stopped showing up. And that silence, that's the storm they never prepared for. The calm before the realization. The absence that speaks louder than any speech you could have made. While they were playing with your loyalty like it had no expiration, you were quietly packing up the pieces of yourself they never bothered to understand. And when you left, it was quiet, but permanent. They didn't think you had it in you. That's what makes it all the more powerful. They saw your kindness as a leash, your empathy as a cage. They never imagined that one day you'd wake up and decide to stop explaining yourself. That you'd stop giving second, third, fourth chances. That you'd walk, not because you were angry, but because you were finally done. They never thought your silence would be permanent. They thought it was a pause, a time out, a break before the next round of forgiveness. But you were rewriting the rules while they were rehearsing their next excuse. And now that you're gone, truly gone, they're realizing they didn't just lose someone. They lost the one person who saw them clearly and still stayed for a while. They lost the person who forgave more than they should have, who gave love in a world that worships indifference. They didn't just lose access to you. They lost the peace you brought, the softness you embodied, the truth you whispered, even when it hurt. Now their world is filled with noise, but none of it feels like home. They meet people, smile through conversations, but none of it lands, none of it. You've stopped rehearsing speeches in your head. No more playing out confrontations that never happen. No more writing paragraphs in your mind you'll never send. That energy has been rerouted to healing, to building, to becoming. You've turned that overthinking into power. That time you used to spend grieving someone alive is now fueling your growth. You're reading more, resting deeper, smiling easier. Not because it's easy, but because you're finally aligned with who you are, not who you had to shrink to be for someone else. They'll try to come back. Maybe months later, maybe years, maybe when you're at your best. But all they'll find is a version of you that doesn't respond the way it used to. They'll throw old jokes, reminders, sweet memories like breadcrumbs, but the trail doesn't lead to your heart anymore. That place has been boarded up, rebuilt, and now the keys belong to you. You don't wait for closure anymore. You are the closure. You are the end of that chapter. Not a comma, not a pause, not a question mark. A clean, final period. So when they ask, what happened to you? Tell them. You finally listened to your silence. You stopped bending. You stopped bleeding for people who flinched at your pain. You stopped proving your worth to people too blind to see it. And now, they'll sit with that echo, that soft, deafening echo of the one they thought would never leave. And maybe, just maybe, one day they'll whisper to themselves, they were right. But by then, you'll be gone, too far reach, too whole to reopen old wounds, too evolved to explain why. Because some people don't deserve a front row seat to your healing. Some people were only meant to be lessons, and once the lesson is learned, you don't go back to the classroom. You keep walking forward, carrying the strength, the wisdom, and the silence that saved you. You were never weak. You were never too much. You were just too real for people still addicted to pretending. Let them keep playing. You're not in the game anymore. And here's the truth they'll never say out loud. They miss you. Not just your presence, but your energy. Your way of seeing them, even when they were trying to hide. Your way of holding space, even when they didn't know how to ask. Your way of loving without keeping score. That kind of presence isn't just missed. It's mourned. But you're not mourning anymore. You've made peace with the end. You've made space for beginnings. You're not bitter. You're not broken. You're just unavailable to the pain that once kept you company. You've switched the frequency. And now they can't reach you, not because you blocked them, but because you've risen beyond their range. You've created a life where your name is sacred, your energy is guarded, and your silence is gold. They don't get to know you anymore. They forfeited that privilege, so let them wander. Let them scroll. Let them romanticize the very things they couldn't appreciate when they had you. Because now the one thing they want most is the one thing they can't have. Another chance. They pushed you too far. And you didn't snap. You shifted. You outgrew the pain. And now they'll have to live with the echo of a voice they never listened to. That's not just closure. That's evolution. Every morning you wake up now feels different. The peace isn't loud, but it's solid. You don't start the day wondering if they're thinking of you. You don't end it hoping they finally understand. That need, that ache, it left when you chose yourself. Because healing isn't about proving your worth to the ones who missed it. Healing is becoming so rooted in your value that their absence doesn't shake you anymore. They were a chapter. You are the whole book. And now the story continues without them. Not in revenge, not in resentment, but in resilience. That's the kind of ending that doesn't need applause. Just quiet strength. And you? You've got more of that than ever before. Keep rising.